to keep the peace. They kept the peace all right, but they never left. And in essence, they betrayed Israel, and they broke that peace treaty. And Israel was justifiably angry by that, as I think any of us would be if we were living in that day. And Rome had a lot of rules that went with them. Rome only really cared about two things. They cared that they got the tribute money. They would always levy a tribute wherever they went, and they would allow the Jewish people or whatever people they conquered to self-rule, and they would allow them to set up their own systems of government. And we see that throughout the Synoptic Gospels, as well as in John. But they wanted the tribute money. And as long as they got that money, and as long as they got peace, Rome was happy. They didn't care how they got it. They would levy out, the way they got their tribute money is they would basically bid out the tax collection. And you could go to Rome and you would say, you know what, you want $1 million, or we'll say shekels, we'll keep it in Jewish denominations here. You want 1 million denariuses, okay? Well, I can get you 1.1 million denariuses, but you have to award the contract to collecting that money to me. And so Rome would say, well, okay, you've promised us more money, I'll let you do that. They didn't care how they did it. All they cared is that they got their money. And so that person, of whom Zacchaeus was undoubtedly one, they would go out into the community and they would extort as much money as they could out of the people with a Roman, but basically a Roman quaternium, or 4 soldiers with them. And they would go into the door and they say, you have to pay your taxes. And he would collect, let's just make up a number, 3 million denariuses. And he would give 1.1 million to Rome, and he would keep the rest. And everyone in Israel knew that the tax collectors did this. And they hated them for that because they were basically a symbol of oppression. And they viewed them as turncoats because these people were almost always Jews that did this. Well, Christ comes on the scene, and we find the disciples, like they always are, trying to curry favor with this Messiah who's teaching this very popular notion of the kingdom. And so when you hear about this guy way down in the south of Israel, preaching around the wilderness of Judea, and he's on the heels of John the Baptist, and you hear that he's preaching the kingdom, as a Jew, your mind naturally goes to, he's going to help us throw off Rome. We're finally going to be independent. And so, our minds today, we see Jesus as being unpopular. People don't want to hear the story of Jesus because we understand more fully what he's all about. He's not offering us an earthly kingdom. But the Jews in that day, that's what they wanted. And if we're not careful, what you want is something that you can view Jesus as promising, even if he never promised that. And it's very important that we look at what Jesus actually said he was, what Jesus actually said he did. And culture all throughout history has basically crafted Jesus into whatever they want it to be, and they frame him in such a way that it makes them the most comfortable. We see that happening today, even in the aspect of love. God is love. God just loves everybody, and he does love everybody, but he doesn't want us to stay the way we are. He doesn't love us as we are. He offers love to us in our current condition, but his love changes us into something better. Okay? So even today, that's happening. But in that day, when Matthew was preaching about the kingdom, or as he recorded the kingdom parables of Christ, Christ's teachings were very popular for all of the wrong reasons. And it wasn't because Christ was clear, or because he wasn't clear. It was because people weren't listening. And it basically culminates in Christ there in the Garden of Gethsemane with his 11 disciples now, one of whom has betrayed him, and so he's not present. But there's his 11 disciples in there with him, and Christ is calling them to pray, and Christ knows there's a great sacrifice coming, and he's going to have to sacrifice himself, and he is very deeply concerned about what's coming, even to the point of saying, Lord or God, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. That aspect of his humanity that we looked at last Sunday. It's difficult for us to imagine. Was Christ not wanting to do the will of his Father, or what was going on? And that's that mystery of humanity. But his disciples, all 3 Gospels, Synoptic Gospels, state that all of his disciples forsook him and fled. The reason they fled is because they finally came face to face with the reality that he wasn't there for what they hoped he was there for. And they had to come face to face, literally, with a Christ who wasn't who they thought he was and was asking them to do something that they didn't want to do. But isn't that the story of Christianity? A Christ who asks us to do something that we don't want to do. I want some feedback this morning. I didn't do this last week. How many of you have ever in your life been hurt deeply by somebody else? Would you raise your hand? Okay. All right. How many of you can remember something, and I'm including my children in this, okay, have ever been hurt, and I realize that many of your parents have passed on, have ever been hurt by your parent or punished for something that you did not do, okay? And you can specifically remember an instance. Okay, my hand's going up, all right? I see Krista's hand going up, okay? I'll talk to you later about that, Krista, all right? Do you know that every single human who has ever been born has a photographic memory? Do you know that? You have a photographic memory when you want to use it. And the thing, at least in my mind and in the experience of those that I've talked to, the one thing that you always remember, and you remember very intricate details of it, is when somebody has hurt you, don't you? And you go over it in your mind and you chew them out and you ream them out and you think that was so unjust. I'll give you an illustration for me. My mom was a piano teacher. And I remember I was probably 4 or 5 years old. And how many 4 or 5-year-old memories do you have that you remember in clear, crisp detail? There aren't very many of them. And one of my mother's students, my mother had bought these white couches. First of all, if you're a parent, don't buy a white couch. That's a mistake. Okay? But she had this white couch, and it was right up against the stairwell. And one of her students, his brother, was there, and we had left a box of crayons out. And that brother, who was probably 2 or 3 years old, didn't know any better. He was taking that crayon, and he was going all over the back of that couch with this crayon. Okay? And I remember him doing it. Well, after the lesson was over, my mom was tinkering around the kitchen, and she turned and she saw that couch. She became very angry. Who drew on my couch? And for some reason, she just knew it was me. And I got spanked for it. Do you think I was angry? Do you think I was? You might. Well, he's the preacher. I don't want to accuse him of being angry. Okay, preachers are just people. Okay, we're people just like you. Come on. Do you think I was angry? I was very angry. The fact that I remember this 40 years later is a testimony to how well my memory was. Okay. You know, we're all like that. We remember these things in intricate detail, don't we? We do. We were wronged by somebody, and it hurts. And because it hurts, it gives us a clear picture of what they need to do to make it right. Well, in Matthew chapter 18, Christ deals with this topic, this sinful attribute of humanity to hang on to things and to let that be a barrier to relationships. You know, my mother and I have not always had the best relationship. She was diagnosed with dementia about 2 weeks ago. And we're discussing right now who's going to be taking care of her. There is so much going on. I've talked to her pastor out in Idaho for probably 30 minutes yesterday, and he went over the fact that he really thinks that she needs someone, preferably a family member, to watch over her and take care of her, lest she injure herself or injure somebody else. And I have all these thoughts swirling around in my head, you know, and one of those thoughts is, well, you know what? She's just going to have to fend for herself. I think back to that couch incident. Okay. And do you know what that is? That's sin. Okay. That's bitterness. That's holding on to things. And I've forgiven her for that. Okay. I'm not holding on to that. I'm just giving that as an illustration. But even though you're supposed to forgive and forget, you can't forget. Okay. Those things are real. And the very act of remembering those things brings anew to us the mercies of God. Now let's look at the text. In this text, Matthew chapter 18, there is the lesson of the nature of God's forgiveness. Man's forgiveness and God's forgiveness are two entirely different things. They don't look the same. See, heart pain has a photographic memory of wrongs it has felt. And as we look at the text, there are two stories in this passage that Christ is using, and they're basically opposite. The first story, we find a person who is illustrated who is not repentant. There's no begging forgiveness. And what are we to do as people when someone wounds us in some way and they are completely unrepentant? How are we to treat them? The second passage illustrates the opposite of that. When someone comes to us and they beg forgiveness, how are we to treat them? And there's basically a story here about what love and mercy should do and what it looks like in both situations. The first one is found in verse 15 through 17. It's the famous church discipline passage. And as you read this passage, I want you to throw out the notion that Christ is talking about a physical church. Because remember, this is before the church was founded. There was no book of Acts written at this time. The Holy Ghost had not fallen upon Peter and the disciples. There was no formation of any church. This is a pattern of love on how we're to solve any problem. And that has applications for me personally, but it also has applications as a church, and most churches have rightly put in their church constitution that church discipline should be carried out this way because this is God's prescribed method for dealing with personal hurt. He says in verse 15, "Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against you, if he sins against you, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. And if he neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let them be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican." A publican is a tax collector. What did the Jews think of tax collectors? Hated him. Now, is Christ really telling us that we're to hate that person? Of course not. But we are to basically treat that person in our day-to-day interpersonal role and how we view that person as an unregenerated person. Because a publican, a tax collector, they abuse their fellow person, and rightly so. You can look at that person and say, that's an unregenerated person. This person needs to be the recipient of my evangelistic efforts. Okay? So this is more than just a pattern for dealing with sin. He says in verse 15 that this is actually a pattern for how we ought to love somebody. See, verse 15, it says, if your brother shall trespass, and the word trespass there, it conveys the sense of any personal injury. So, for instance, a very small aspect of this is you're opening the door, and as you're opening the door, you accidentally close it on someone who is coming in who you didn't know was coming in. And so you quickly reach over and you grab that door and say, I'm sorry. Okay, that is a very small application of what we're talking about. Public courtesy is that when you have an injury